In tonight's episode, I'm going to be telling 5 terrifying tales of real-life experiences with people dealing with creatures from the darkness. Get ready. Now, this isn't a story I share a lot. Coming from the backcountry of Idaho, I've met plenty of people who've claimed to see the famous Sasquatch of the Northern Hemisphere. Those stories are often shared openly in bars of where I grew up and widely accepted as a quantity of people here have also seen them. But I saw something much different. Wolves had been reintroduced into the Idaho wilderness in 1995 and were actually a protected species up until the fall of 2011. So, Idaho and the area all around Stanley were particularly dense in wolves, and many people had problems with picking off livestock and pets. It was August of 2010 when me and some friends decided to take a long 50-mile backpacking trip through the Sawtooth Mountains and fly fish at a few lakes that were far off the trail most people would often take. These produced the best fishing since they were rarely visited. There were 5 of us, and we also brought 5 horses, so we had 3 guys rode and the other horses packed cooking gear and other essential equipment. Me and a friend I will call Josh decided we would walk to 50 miles since we were both leaving for the military that fall. The first day, we hiked around 10 miles and stopped at Lake Taxaway for the night. The only eventful thing that happened that night was a terrible high mountain thunderstorm that destroyed my tent and got me and my gear all soaking wet. Needless to say that the next morning, I was in a pretty bad mood. Deciding I needed to be cheered up, Josh made a plan that the other guys and horses would continue on our previously planned route and set up a camp while me and Josh went off the trail a few miles to try and fish at a small lake that we had both been to previously and had relatively good luck. We spent the day fishing this lake and honestly catching far more brook trout than we have ever had before. After eating a few of the trout we caught, we shared a few drinks out of a bottle of Jack Daniels that I decided would be worth the extra weight in my pack. We both decided to sleep under the stars that night since it showed no signs of rain. I woke up at about 2 a.m. I remember sitting in my mummy bag trying to figure out what had woke me up. A few seconds later, I recognized the howling of a wolf pack somewhere in the mountains. I figured it had woke Josh up too, who I heard unzipping his sleeping bag to grab his Glock, the same thing that I was doing. Mine had been in my mummy bag the whole night and was currently sitting on my chest. The sounds of wolves were not new to us. I mean, both of us were experienced hunters and backpackers, and we had seen our fair share of these furry animals. The area we were in was kind of a saddle between 2 peaks and acted as a funnel for wildlife, including wolves. They would move further up the mountains through the area we were in on their way to the Grangian, where there was more flat grassland, which meant more prey. Now, after a minute or 2 of the howling, I was starting to fall back asleep, and that was when it went quiet. But not just the wolves, the crickets, the small rustling, the bushes. It felt like even the air had been shushed. And that's when we heard the sound that will live on in my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was deeper and throatier than the wolves. It sounded like a human trying to imitate a wolf's call over a loudspeaker. The sound of it made me feel cold to my bones. It made me want to curl into a ball. It ended, and the world stayed silent for a little while longer before returning to the life-filled night that was natural. Neither of us slept that whole night, and in fact the next morning, we both began hiking again, joking about how scared we were the previous night, both just chalking it up to maybe a larger alpha wolf. But we decided to take a different route to the base camp that our friends had set up as a shortcut. This path would take us through some backcountry that neither of us had been through, and by the looks of it, not many others had either. The brush got thicker here, and the ground leveled out. As we walked and talked, we both sort of fell into a nervous and cautious silence. There was something wrong. We both felt it, and it made us nervous. There was this smell. It was strong and musky, like the smell in a dog pound, but it was everywhere. And at one point, we thought we could hear something moving in the brush off to our right. We finally started up the mountainside and got out of the trees onto the open flat ridge, and we got out snacks and began eating. Looking ahead of us, and we could see the smoke from what we had assumed was our friend's camp, maybe 2 or so miles away. We started to walk and joke about bad juju, the same kind we had felt in that smaller valley. But suddenly, Josh got quiet and pale, and so I looked behind me, following his gaze to the opposing side of the small valley, and maybe no more than 400 yards away. It took me a second to see, but there was something dark moving up on the hill. For a second, I presumed it was another hiker, but it was bigger, with the bulk in all the wrong places. I mean, I'm a big guy myself, but just a little over 5'7" and around 165 pounds. This thing had to be around 7 feet tall, judging by the trees it was near. The thing that threw me off were its legs. They didn't seem short and stocky like a bear. They were long and thick, like that of an Olympic sprinter. We were too far to see its face clearly, but it very clearly had cropped ears and a short snout, and it just stood there. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, and it was a bear standing in the upright position, and it was just being weird, but it dropped on all fours, took off into the trees, and the way it ran gave me the chills. Its arms looked longer than its legs, vaulting it down the hill at an angle away from us. Its back did not stay flat like a bear's. Instead, it kind of arched, like a man in a costume bending over to a bear crawl. It was out of sight before we realized it was even moving. Me and Josh quietly stood up and more or less jogged the 2 miles downhill to our friend's camp. When we got there, we were both sweating and completely out of breath. When questioned, we made some excuse about trying to race to the camp from the hill, but one of the guys was fairly new to the outdoors and we didn't really want to freak the kid out, So we spent the day at the lake and we camped there and fished for our dinner. That night, we all shared some drinks and ate some amazing Dutch oven cobbler before turning the lanterns off for the night. Me and Josh decided to share a tent, and neither of us wanted to admit that we were both a little freaked out by what we had seen earlier. And once again, I woke up at around midnight. I could hear Josh slowly breathing and somebody else snoring in another tent. While in a tent, it's hard to exactly pinpoint where noises are coming from. While in a tent, it's hard to hear exactly and pinpoint where the noises are coming from, but I could distinguish where the horses were. They were neighing and pawing at the ground, which usually means they are distressed or anxious about something, and so this put me off a little. Then I heard it again, that same guttural howl from the previous night. Only this time it was much closer. It howled about every minute and continued to grow louder every time. I could tell Josh was awake, and like me, he was paralyzed with fear. The horses had gone quiet, and the next morning, we learned that they had broken their highline and had taken off. We heard slow, hesitant footsteps on the other side of the camp. Along with the sound of it was walking, the sound of low growling and sniffing, and it started to slowly begin to move. The breathing was like a giant dog and panting. I couldn't even move. I couldn't even breathe. I was afraid it would hear me. And I hear it walk past her tent. It stops, and I just was filled with visions of it ripping the tent open and tearing us apart. And I heard the audible click of a safety being taken off a handgun in another tent. Then the thing turned and ran. After this, none of us slept. The next morning, we quickly broke down camp and found the horses in the nearby meadow that they stopped in. After this, we picked up and left our trip early. None of us wanted to try our luck with a second night. I haven't tried talking to the hunters around Stanley and the Grangian about it. They are hesitant, but say whatever it is, it kills cattle from time to time, and they think there are multiples of them. The local police departments even have a file for it since it has taken so many cattle. People even believe it is responsible for the occasional hiker or hunter who disappears. It supposedly leaves prints that are like an elongated human foot with longer clawed toes. I've scoured and searched the web for it and other things like it. The images of dogman are the closest thing that resembles what I saw that day. Easy to say, I don't spend too many nights alone in that area of the sawtooths anymore. I was working in a construction site late into the night, getting some tools out of my truck when the most horrific roar came from the woods surrounding the site. A few of them on the night crew stopped, looked around and seemed distressed, and we kind of just shrugged and looked at each other. Although spooked, we did our best to ignore it. After all, we had a job to do. We weren't going to let some silly noises stop us. So we continued doing our night crew work, and things went on as normal for us for the next few hours on and off. We actually forgot about the roar until we heard some banging and clanging out by our work trucks. Since I was the supervisor on shift, I thought a couple of things. Number one of our crew members were banging around, possibly destroying things or trying to play a prank. Or two, it was somebody trying to steal our stuff. I figured option 2 was more likely. I ran over to where my truck was, and as I'm about 20 feet away from the truck, out pops this horrible looking face from behind the bed of the truck. I completely stop in my tracks, and this shape erects up from behind the truck, towering over the bed. It looks down into the bed and reaches in to pick up what looked to be a dead animal from the bed and flung it over its shoulder. If I had to guess, maybe a dead small doe, and then looked right back at me, turned around, and walks off into the night. Had I just seen a werewolf in the living flesh? The teeth in the face, I was stunned for a few moments, not sure what had just happened. I felt like I was living in a dream. In that very moment, it was so vivid. These kinds of things don't exist in reality, so what had I seen? The teeth had what stuck out to me the most. No pun intended, and it really bothered me. Nothing should have that many teeth. It was like looking into the mouth of a shark. So many teeth, looking all razor blade sharp. I knew, deep down, that those were teeth that were meant to rip meat to pieces. After a moment of being in shock and trying to process what had just happened, I slowly walked back to where my workers were, and they were laughing and joking around, acting as if I'd seen a ghost. I think they could see how pale I was when I just tried to downplay it and demand they get back to work. The rest of the night crew went on as normal, and we had continued to work until sunrise. As I made my way back to the truck to leave my shift, there was enough light so things were visible. There were blood splatters all along the back side of my truck. And that's when I finally put the pieces together and realized that whatever that banging was, whatever that being standing behind my truck earlier was banging that dead doe against my truck. That's exactly what it was. I don't know if it was doing that to kill the deer or what, or possibly doing it to get somebody's attention to draw them over to the truck for a potential ambush, but whatever it was gave me instant chills as I had those memories flooding back to me. Those darn teeth I cannot get out of my head. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I tried to shove it deep down as much as possible and forget about it. I got in my truck, ignoring it, got home, used the hose and sprayed down all the blood. And that particular job site that I got called in to cover a supervisor, I turned down and found something else. That had scared the daylights out of me, and now I have second thoughts about ever returning to the night shift. I've enjoyed hunting throughout the various forests located throughout Pennsylvania. I don't have a particular favorite. I enjoy all of them. And there's many of us around here that enjoy a good bow hunt, and I am no exception. The forest in question is higher elevated, full of white pine and oak trees all throughout with thicker flowers and brush. This was back in 2003, and I've had several friends who've been hunting in and around this area for years now. I've got warnings that because of the lush population of deer, there's supposedly a high amount of Bigfoot activity in certain areas. I was a Bigfoot believer before this happened to me, but I had no idea these wolf creatures existed. I didn't even think it was a possibility, and I've gone hunting in this forest for a few years prior to this event and never had anything strange occur. So, I was confident and ready to get myself a nice trophy buck this year. I got up in the wee early hours before sunrise, made it out there with my bow. I remember the air being crisp and cool. The onset of fall was really setting in this particular year. I remember walking quite a ways and making it to one of the stands that I had set up in the area. This particular one, I had perched quite high up on the tree. More so than normal. I climbed up and climbed in, pulled out my coffee flask and sat and waited. I don't know at what point that I noticed the silence, but I became aware after some time the woods died. You could hear a pin drop from a mile away. It felt eerie. I've been doing this for a while, and I've never had my skin crawl like it did in that moment. From what I would estimate to be about 300 plus yards away in the woods was a bunch of whimpering and howling. This was loud, it sounded distorted, not like you would expect if you heard a coyote or a wolf, both of which I've heard, and it didn't quite match the sounds. I was curious, and so I kept looking around, looking for any movement or anything possible that I could see. Still nothing. The whimpering and howling had stopped, and I began to hear movement in the brush from a little ways away, coming in my direction. Light now was just starting to break, and I could start to make out the minimal details around me. Things were still dead silent, other than this movement that began sounding closer and closer. It sounded heavy, and I wasn't sure if it was a deer coming my way or what, but I could make out that there were multiple whatever animals were approaching my direction. I heard branches breaking to my left, and out steps these three beings. Beings is what I'll call them because they certainly were not animals. And they were not humans. These three things walked in unison together, very coordinated, very organized, very tall. If I had to guess, well over 6 feet. Their fur was charcoal black and looked to be like they absorbed the light in the area. Their eyes, though, all of them had this horrible yellow glow to them as they slowly hunched over and walked slowly through the forest below, taking their time with each stride. I tried to stay quiet and not make a sound as I went into full-on panic mode. These monsters, whatever they were, gave off an incredibly evil vibe. If they wanted to climb up into my stand and devour me alive, they could have easily. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Every step these things took, you could feel it in the ground below. I could tell these creatures weighed a great deal of weight. It didn't surprise me with how much mass they carried around, with how tall they were, and their stature. One of them stopped only a few feet away from me, right by my stand. This thing started lifting its head up and sniffing the air. It sounded loud, like a bear sniffing right outside somebody's tent. In that moment, I lost it, urinating all over myself. I was so scared. I'm watching this transpire all before my eyes. I'm very fortunate that my deer stand was up quite a ways, because had it been lower, it could have just reached right up and pulled me out. Now this thing sniffed the air for a moment and did some sort of weird thing with its mouth. I can't even begin to describe the noise. It was like a clicking noise mixed with a guttural sigh. I don't know how to portray it accurately. It was communicating though with the other two. The others stopped and looked up in my direction, and I felt like in that moment I was ready to have a heart attack. I don't think these things saw me, but they looked right up in my stand. One of those things must have signaled for the other two that there was a person up in that stand, and I tightly gripped my combat knife like it was my life. I usually keep it strapped to my thigh, just praying my death would be swift and painless, knowing there was no way I'd be able to fight off 3 of these things. But they just stood there, all of them making this clicking, chattering guttural noise, and then continued on westward. Once they were out of sight, I began crying. I was petrified. I had had a hard time even convincing myself to move my body, and I needed to leave now before those things got back. If I was caught on foot, I was for sure a dead man, and I was not going to have that. I managed to work my body enough to climb down my stand, and I ran quickly back to where I left originally. I should have probably given a little more clarity on what I saw and how exactly long that lasted. Because of the early morning hours with the sun barely just breaking through, light conditions were poor at best. So a lot of what I saw were massive shapes and silhouettes and those darn glowing yellow eyes. The shape was like a massive body with a dog-like head and pointed ears on top. It reminded me of a German Shepherd, actually. Same with the face. I can make out a very visible snout with more specific details that were more hard to point out. I watched the entire thing play out in front of me, and I think it stuck its snout up in the air because it had possibly smelt me and was trying to communicate to the others that I was there. Their chattering almost reminded me of them arguing amongst themselves, unsure of what to do next. But again, it was very brief. They kept the same pace and stride all the way to where they were no longer visible. The entire occurrence probably only lasted 3 to 5 minutes at most, but in that moment, it was endless. It felt as if time itself had come to an utter stop. I didn't think I was going to make it out of there alive, and that experience alone really ruined the outdoors and hunting for me for quite a while. I had a hard time returning to what I was passionate about. It took an entire 6 years for me to muster the courage to approach the woods again and hunt, and the first few times, I did not go back alone either. I wasn't risking something like that ever happening again, and I never did go back to those woods. I instead chose to hunt with friends on their land, on their properties. I even told some of my hunting buddies about what I went through, the same buddies who have had hairy run-ins with Bigfoot, and they themselves were in disbelief at what I had to say. One believes that I ran into a pack of what he believes were dogmen, while another friend asked me if I think I encountered a family of Bigfoots, but it did not behave the way you hear Bigfoots behaving, and I don't think Bigfoots have snouts either, nor do they have pointed ears on the tops of their heads. These animals, the way they were hunched over, the way their arms were longer, it just seemed wrong. You know, I've never seen a squatch in my day, but my buddies who have had plenty of run-ins with them have told me a lot about them. I got a feeling that whatever this pack or family was, it was certainly not Sasquatch. I'm just glad that I was able to survive this night and tell you my story. My wife and I used to live in southern Ohio for quite some time years back. In fact, my wife actually worked as a nurse and would be pulling all sorts of random shifts. Sometimes her schedule would call her into work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., while other times she would have to work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. It was all so sporadic, and it really began to wear her down the few years she worked at this hospital. They were extremely short-staffed during this time period, and she was willing to give her soul to this job, having just recently got out of med school and was desperately trying to build her career credentials. I would always try and call her on her breaks to the hospital and check up on her. This was back in the early 90s, so we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. Everything was all landlines. One night, she was returning home in the early morning hours. I can't give you an exact time because I believe my wife doesn't exactly remember. She knows it was after midnight, but before sunrise. She was driving back home, having to make a sharp bend in the road before pulling into another road that leads down to our house. As she made this sharp bend in the road, her headlights house shone something straight from the pits of hell. Crouching about 50 feet away from the road was this large black shape that had a wolf-like appearance but had a human physique. She said when her headlights hit this thing, it gave no shine or reflection. Instead, she told me that this thing had these cold, black, dead eyes. It was like they and its body absorbed the light of the headlights of the car. Everything else lit up around it. Even the fur, the tips kind of glistened with the light. But she said the eyes were solid black. She was in hysterics and terrified and stayed. She floored it out of there and stayed in hysterics until she pulled up to the house, runs in, and collapses on the ground crying. That is a night I will never forget. I knew for years afterwards that she had nightmares about that same dark face with the black eyes haunting her in her sleep. Terrified it would find her and come after her. We had moved about 4 years later, but she never ended up seeing the same thing that night. I really have no choice but to believe her. I mean, my wife is a very logical, very reasonable individual. She wouldn't just make something up like that. It still haunts me how she came in the house trembling and weeping. For a while, she had wanted to see a psychiatrist about hallucinating, but claims it was real and she did not make it up. She had been working all sorts of shifts for a long time and possibly chalked it up to exhaustion, but even then, it doesn't make sense. This was the first and last time she ever saw it. I've never written this to somebody before, and I'm hoping you'll be receptive to my experience. I remember it vividly, clear as day, every detail, and so I'm gonna lay it out for you, the nitty-gritty. 10 years ago, I had just turned 21. Well, almost. It would have been August of 2009. To celebrate, me and 3 friends of mine drove all the way out to the Hiawatha State Forest in northern Michigan. We drove from Washington State. We wanted to make a road trip out of it with my buddy Nathan, who was with me. He had family up in northern Michigan. Our plan was to stop and see his family briefly, and then go party. I was also with my other buddy CJ and his girlfriend Ashley. We had packed everything up on a Friday and left for northern Michigan. We spent about a total of 3 days to reach our destination at Nathan's aunt's and uncle's house. Between all the frequent stops and bathroom breaks, we were pretty antsy from being in the car for so long, just wanted to get out and go celebrate. We had come to a party, and that's exactly what we were set out to do. Before we left his family's house, we loaded up on some Jack Daniels and good beer. I've had a very interesting past with Jack. Our plan was to head north deep into the Hiawatha National Forest and find a good spot off trail just to hike in and set up camp. Or so that was the plan. We drove up quite a ways, and if I remember accurately, we passed Mapleville, which is a ways up there in Wisconsin. If you head east on Highway 41, you'll reach this lone road called NF13, with deep woods on both sides of the road. This is where we were going to venture off and begin our celebration. There are several different pullouts. Well, I'm going to call them pullouts for the story because they're not necessarily roads either. They're more like pathways with only vehicle markings on the ground to indicate that you can even drive down them. We suspected there to be campers or whatnot in them since they were just unmarked. We didn't want to invade anybody's privacy, so we pulled off our car to the right of the road and got all of our stuff out and ready to go. We've got all of our backpacks on and the camping equipment and our beer, and we're going to head out with the handfuls of this stuff. There's no marked camping spots or campgrounds anywhere where we were headed. We were going into the wilderness. I was aware that there was a campground roughly 20 miles near us. I'm not sure whether north or south, but we wanted to just go and explore the woods to be more secluded. I knew there was a stream west of NF13, so we headed off in that general direction. We probably spent 2 or so hours pushing onward west through the thicker woods. We had our backpacks, tents, and cases of beer, and it took us hours with all the breaks we had to get to and find the perfect spot. But once we found it, that was it. We quickly set up camp and started blasting our music through our iPod. We had brought little speakers that were battery powered that we started blaring rap through, and were cracking beers and drinking Jack Daniels and going crazy at this point. At this time, I don't know the exact time, but the sun was now beginning to set. It was August, so I don't know, maybe 7, 8 p.m. Either way, we had a ton of beer, and I shotgunned so much that I vomited at one point. Ashley and CJ were having a great time, but sought to retreat to their tent multiple times for about 15 or so minutes because they needed to talk in private. We all know what they were doing, and they were pretty vocal about that. Well, Ashley was, at least anyway. That would just leave me and Nathan to pound more beers. bears. Now this repeated until about 11 p.m., and I remember that because I left my phone in my backpack all day and wanted to see if I had any service at all. Pulled it out. I didn't have service, but I remember it was right about 11:02. I felt fairly drunk, but not completely phased out. Nathan was so drunk, and I think CJ and Ashley were either having pillow talk or they had passed out at this point. So much for staying up late. I thought Nathan and I at this point would start to tone it down and sit by the fire and BS for maybe another hour or two before it was time to settle into our tents. Oh, I should expand on that. We brought 2 tents in total, one for me and Nathan to share and one for CJ and Ashley that they shared. They were across from one another with the fire in between us. Once in our tent, it did not take long for us to settle into our sleeping bags with a hearty goodnight, and in my half-drunken stupor, I passed out. Next thing I know, I'm being shaken awake by Nathan. Wake up, wake up. It took me a couple of seconds to come to, but now I'm pissed. He's woken me up, so I snap at him. He grabs me and says he thinks there's some sort of gorilla outside our tent. I shut up and I quietly listen and intently, just like he is. Interestingly, the first thing I hear or didn't hear was the sound of the forest. It was August, and the forest should have been full and alive of crickets and bugs all night, like it was during our drinking binge, but now it had fallen silent. I didn't hear a single sound. Then I hear heavy thuds, like from a heavy animal, and then I started thinking, was there a bear walking around outside our tent? I mean, it sounded big. I could tell it was close. Me and Nathan looked at each other and held our breath. The last thing we would want is, say, a grizzly bear. We heard this thing get close to our tent and start sniffing, and I really began to freak out and trying my best not to scream. I was terrified of bears, and I knew absolutely nothing about the temperament of bears other than the fact that they can eat you. The sniffing continued, and then this animal seemed to totter off away from our tent. It started to huff and grunt like bears do. We heard it begin to leave our tent and can hear it still making noises. The noises began to trail off further, and it began to get quieter. And I remember telling Nathan that we can now relax. The bear was gone and probably just strolling through. As soon as I finished this sentence, though, I hear this crazy animal squealing roar like I had never heard in my life. Nathan's eyes and attention snaps over to the side of the tent, freaking out. We start hearing a bunch of roaring and growling sounds and commotion going on. It was hard to tell how far away it was. It was in the middle of the night and it was pitch black outside. It couldn't have been too far away. We knew it was somewhere close by, and the roaring ceased after maybe 30 seconds. I could not exactly tell what the heck we had just heard. It sounded like a bear fighting off a dinosaur. It was the most frightening thing to listen to in the middle of the night. Nathan and I are sitting there basically crapping bricks at this point, shaking when we hear CJ scream out in the distance. It was undeniably his voice. Nathan and I shot each other a panicked look. I quickly and slowly got up as quietly as I could, unzipped myself out, and got outside the tent. I could see the door flap was open, and so I turned back to Nathan, told him it was CJ who was gone, and I slightly, very so slightly, stuck my head out of the tent, yelled but whispered at the same time, "Ashley, are you in there?" And I heard her softly sobbing in the tent. She had whispered up telling me she heard CJ scream too, and all the commotion, but was too scared to get out of the tent. She did not even know he had left until all the commotion had woken her. The woods at this time were silent, and we weren't sure what to do. Nathan argued in whispers that we needed to go out and look for him to make sure he's okay. I began arguing back, saying, "Did you hear what we had just heard? I'm not going out there with what we had just heard." And that's when we began to hear more noises in the brush nearby. And then we heard the growling. This low, deep, bassy growl. It was not all the same energy like the bear brought earlier. This was different entirely. The bear that we were certain was in our camp before was sniffing around and probably just curious. We could tell it was a bear, just alone due to what was happening and the sounds and the breaths and the thudding on the ground. There's just a certain quality and sound that bears make. I mean, it was unmistakable. This, though, was different. The footsteps sounded incredibly heavy, but heavy in a different way, like it was walking on 2 legs, not 4, and it sounded slower, like this animal was trying to be sly and sneaky. The growling and humming it sort of emitted just sounded evil. I don't know how to relay the emotion. Nathan and I turned white, and we knew we were in grave danger. Something else besides a bear was outside our tent, and I was frozen in fear, but I knew I had to do something. I didn't have any weapons on me or near me, and I had a pocket knife in my backpack somewhere, but that wasn't going to help me out at all in this situation. Nathan pulls out his police flashlight, which I didn't even know he had, out of a sleeping bag, and shines it outside the tent flap, looking around for whatever he could outside the tent. My heart dropped in fear of him invoking whatever animal was out there. He didn't care though. He just wanted to scare whatever animal was out there away, and at some point, this being was fully illuminated right by the tree. The nastiest, creepiest looking wolf you could ever see. It was looking down down to the ground and slowly began to lift its head up to meet its gaze with Nathan's beam of light and let out a very nasty howl. It was pissed. I began crying, and the size of this thing's claws and teeth alone were enough to do it right in that moment. But its size alone and the fact that we were looking at what we were convinced was a werewolf standing 30 feet away from our tent really drove it home. Nathan quickly turned the flashlight off, zips up the tent as fast as he could, and dove back into the sleeping bag. I have never seen him so scared or pale. I thought he was going to vomit. I was on the verge of having a mental breakdown, knowing what we just saw was real and was right outside our tent. Now we're stuck here, CJ is gone, and poor Ashley is all alone in that tent nearby, completely unsure of her safety. We had no weapons, and there's a thing walking around outside of our tents, probably gonna try and kill us. But things eventually quieted down, and we didn't hear anything. Not even the thudding of this thing's footfalls walking around. And that made us much more nervous. What if it was plotting? What if it was going to ambush us? And what if it was employing stealth tactics to get us to stay awake and to get us at our weakest? We could not fall asleep in case this thing tried to do something. This was the worst passing of time I've ever experienced in my life. We were probably in that tent for 10 hours, just lying awake, constantly on high alert and aware of our surroundings but could not move. We finally, at some point or another, began to see daybreak. I didn't want to risk getting out of the tent until we had the most light possible. We were exhausted from the sheer adrenaline rush and the intense amount of fear. None of us had slept at all. If at any point during this experience I still had alcohol in my system, it had been long gone now. This whole experience had left me stone cold sober. I guess I should have checked my phone for the time, but I didn't. It was summer, so it gets bright early, like 5 a.m. So maybe we weren't in the tent for 10 hours, although it felt like it. It was probably more like 5 or 6. So right around then, Nathan finally signaled for us to get out of the tent and leave everything. We were gonna grab our essentials, but screw the tent and the beer. We didn't want anything to do with being out this far in close contact with that freak of nature. Once it was light enough, we ran out of the tent, and we could see that enough of our camp had been thoroughly rummaged through. Whether it had been done by the bear or whatever it is we saw, we weren't quite sure. We run over to Ashley and CJ's tent, and Ashley had been curled up in the fetal position. We woke her up, told her we need to go find CJ and get out now. She had somehow managed to fall asleep from pure exhaustion. I don't blame her. We began to head back towards the way we came. Luckily, I know we weren't far from the vehicle, so we headed back in that direction. Now, this is where things got real. We're running back with just our backpacks and things towards where we had parked on NF13. We're yelling for CJ, but nothing, of course. There was a blood trail we were following, but we couldn't make out what it belonged to. If I had to guess, it looked like an animal had been killed and then dragged. It was dragged in the same direction we were heading. So we walked back in the early morning, running still, and these drag marks went alongside of us up on a small hill, and as we get to the very top, there it was, or at least what was left of it. It was the large black bear. The body was bloody, mangled, and crushed to a pulp, with its guts ripped out and strewn all across the ground. This thing, an adult male black bear, looked like it had been crushed by a boulder. Nathan and I were speechless when we came across its body, and Ashley gasped and began crying, begging us to take her home. I knew in that moment, if we did not get back to the car now and escape, we were going to be next. I don't know what was out there, but whatever it was could take on a black bear. I didn't want to mess with it. Again, I was filled with fear and adrenaline, and at one point, back to the car, the thought that CJ might be killed, that alone haunted me. We never found him, and we did eventually make it back to the car by the miracle of God himself. It was still earlier in the morning, and still no signs of CJ. Now we're standing by the car, arguing whether to leave and to go and find help, or to go back in the woods and look for CJ. I mean, we couldn't just leave him, and Ashley is still crying hysterically, while me and Nathan are continuously arguing about what to do, sleep deprived, terrified, and we see this lone car in the distance heading our way. And we see the lights and immediately recognize it is a cop car. We turn and signal the car down. The car stops. The cop gets out and begins asking us a ton of questions. Are we the friends of CJ? On and on. We explain to the officer our side of the story of what had happened, and he tells us that a young man who went by the name of CJ had apparently come out on the same road only hours before, flagging down a fellow officer, telling his side of the story, which was identical to ours, who is now in the hospital. CJ's claim was that he was attacked by some unknown animal and suffered deep wounds in his back and left arm. This particular officer was patrolling this road NF13 to see if there were any signs of CJ's friends. CJ's wounds were written off as a bear attack due to the claw size and the amount of sheer tissue damage and blood loss, before almost bleeding out. Once we were able to go see him in the hospital, we began getting questioned by other officers, and they at one point believed that we were behind plotting CJ's death. Turns out, the PD here actually believed at some point we had conspired to attack and kill CJ CJ and cover it up under the conspiracy that it was done by a whole werewolf-bear phenomena, and that we were all three going to be charged for attempted murder. However, once further questioning was done, we were let off the hook. CJ's story once again had come to save us. He was able to tell his story in full that lined up with all of our other stories, what had happened, what we had experienced, etc. Detectives got to him before we did, so they were able to get his story first and foremost. He had told them that he had gotten up in the middle of the night to take a piss when he thought he heard a bear approaching, and then he says he heard all this crazy commotion, like two big animals fighting, and he fled off into the night with only his phone light. Something ran after him, something that looked like a wolf walking on two legs, and tried to grab him, but it missed. It slashed his back and left arm pretty bad, and he says he ran, but that it was a blur, and he did not even realize he was bleeding so bad because of all his adrenaline, and he literally had fat oozing out of his wounds. They were so deep. And that's pretty much where my story ends. I remember it vividly, and like I said, I'll carry it around with me forever. I'll never forget it. I still keep in contact with Nathan on Facebook and don't see much of CJ anymore. He took a coding job down in West Virginia and obviously made a full recovery. I'll have to see if I can get him to send me a pic of his scars so I can show you. They're gnarly. Oh, and him and Ashley broke up a long time ago, so I haven't kept in contact with her in ages. But there you go. Believe it or not, I swear by the Bible and all that is holy that this is what happened to us, including the accusations that we somehow tried to murder CJ and that whole mess. I'm just glad it's in my past now where it belongs. So there it is, guys, 5 terrifying tales of strange cryptids and creatures. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that like button, leave a comment down below, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and keep all your notifications on so that way YouTube will let you know every time I release a great new piece of content. As always, guys, I will see you all in the very next video.